Good evening. Steve and I agree on lots of things, and one of the things we agree on is that we've been dreading this for weeks. But we also wanted to start by saying that we both agree that salvation comes through faith in Jesus. And whatever we believe, or whatever you believe regarding Genesis or the creation of the world, is not a salvation issue.
And we also agree that God is the creator, that he made everything, and that everything points to his glory, and that will include science. God set up the physical rules and laws that govern the universe. I think the issue is, how is it interpreted?
And although Steve and I might disagree on how we interpret this issue, we can share fellowship and unity in Christ and respect one another. I hadn't realised it was communion. I'm actually really glad it is, and that we can share around the table, share the body of Christ there. But Christians should not really be part of cancel culture, certainly not when we disagree with other believers.
Okay. So Stephanie has kindly given me first go. This is not a debate. We're just sharing with you where we come from on this particular issue. And both face massive time constraints. Can you just speak for 10 minutes? He says. So forgive me if this is sort of a bit headliney and a bit bullet pointy. Do my best. I'll start with Hebrews 11. By faith we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Okay, so the fact that creation happened is a matter of faith, but faith doesn't mean that we reject reason. Rather, it undergirds it. All of us come to any bit of information based on our worldview, on what we believe. So what we will believe will affect how we understand any information that we come across. So just because we say, I believe that I might understand, doesn't mean we're anti-understanding. I hope that's clear. So a straightforward reading of the Bible, to me, suggests the following. So after what Murray read for us, the creation of male and female is picked up, and Adam and Eve are treated as real people, as are Noah, as are Cain and Abel, until we get through to Abraham. And there's not a point at which Genesis says, this is where the history starts. It just sort of assumes all the way through. And if you trace the genealogies that the Bible is full of, which you don't often hear read in churches, you will find that they go back as far as about 4000 BC, which would tend to give a date for the earth as 6,000 years old. And some of you will be, gasp, that can't be true. Well, I'll just ask you to pause on that one, perhaps. I'll also add in that Moses believed in a 7-day creation when he gave the 10 Commandments. Jesus talked about Adam and Eve when he was talking about divorce. He talked about Noah when he's talking about the end times. Paul and Peter both accept creation and flood in the way they talk about their faith. We'll see a little bit more about Paul in a moment. And the early church actually came to believe that Jesus is the creator. I say through him, everything that has been formed has been made. That was their opinion of Jesus. So there's a sort of straightforward reading of the Bible. And if we add in some of Paul's teaching on sin and salvation. So Murray just read, this isn't Paul, I know. Murray just read that God saw everything that he made and it was very good. And then at Genesis 3, it explains everything went wrong, and it went wronger and wronger and wronger until God stepped in and flooded the earth. And you'll have heard in Sunday school about a man called Noah who built a big boat. And so, that is the Genesis pattern of things. And Paul in Romans chapter 5 says, therefore, just as sin entered into the world through one man, and death through sin. And then he goes on to say, because of that, then the death of one man can actually save everybody. So can you see how Paul actually pins his understanding of salvation on Adam actually sinning and bringing death into the world? So God saw it and it was very good. That implies there's no death or disease. Then sin comes into the world and it all goes rotten because of one man's sin. And then Paul is arguing that because of the one man, Jesus Christ, then salvation can come and rescue can come there. And that, for me, doesn't sit easily with there being millions of years of death and disease leading up to that point. Through one man's sin, death came into the world. Now, I'm guessing many of you might be thinking, well, it's not long enough for these things to happen. But a lot of that might simply be that we are surrounded from birth by the casual acceptance that this is the way to understand things. So can the evidence around be understood to accommodate this view? I've just really got time for three things which I'll throw at you to ponder, and a little extra one, and then I hand back over to Stephanie. So first thing to think about for me, and this is not necessarily in a logical order, is actually irreducible complexity. Do you know what irreducible complexity is? A mousetrap must have 6 bits, or it won't be a mousetrap. You could have 5 of the bits and you won't ever catch a mouse. Okay, it has to work straight away. And that's the concept of irreducible complexity. Okay, now, consider the human eye. I was actually watching one of the Reith lectures. You know the Reith lectures every year where a scientist explains what's going on? Well, he said, the evolution of the eye has been a problem, but here's an explanation of it. And he said, a group of cells became light sensitive. Now, he didn't actually say why or how, but a group of cells became light sensitive, and then it began to form a bowl round it to focus light onto these light sensitive cells. And then he said, and then the lens was added. Okay, now that was a scientist explaining to children how the eye evolved. Now think about the complexity of the eye and what you actually need. You need a receptor and you need something to receive the information and to translate it. And we also have eyes which revolve, you know, you move them around and like look around. We have eyes that focus, eyes that are designed so that we don't get blinded anytime there's a sudden change of light, eyes that, but all these things need to come together. You don't just sort of arrive towards them. So that's irreducible complexity. And the sort of transitional thing doesn't seem to work, for me at least, there, what is called evolution. Then if you go on to look at DNA, which I'm not going to, but it's even more complicated than that, the way that it's all wound up and what actually goes on in DNA. And I'll just throw in that Darwin said there'd be thousands of transitional fossils discovered, and there haven't been. But that's irreducible complexity. Then I would point you to the impact of a year-long global flood. Because a year-long global flood explains stratification. That is why we find rocks in strata, because when you get flowing water, things settle at different rates and you have strata going through there. It explains fossils, because fossils need to be created in immediate anaerobic circumstances. So like if an elephant dies on the African plains these days, um, every evidence of it is gone in 15 years. Now, if something died and then was slowly covered up, it would be gone before it was covered if it's going to take 10,000 years for this layer of thing to be. It explains what's called the Cambrian explosion. The lowest level that they've got down to is the Cambrian rocks, and then you find life. And it suddenly explodes into complicated life. It's not sort of simple life down there. Trilobites apparently have one of the most complicated eye systems, so it's said, of any creature. You know, they could see underwater in all sorts of ways, and they're found right down at the bottom, already complicated. So it's not a question of things getting more and more developed as you go through it. It explains why you find marine fossils up in the top of the Himalayas. It explains why a lot of fossils seem to be in their death throes. You know, they're found sort of thrown around all right. A lot of fossils are found in one place, as if they've been put into that place. A global flood can explain issues relating to the Grand Canyon as well. All of these things in a way that long ages don't. The long ages thing isn't, for me, such a good explanation. Research, do you remember a mountain blew up in Mount St. Helens in Washington State a while ago? Well, there was a lot of research done into that, and they found all sorts of interesting things that happen when you get a catastrophic event. For instance, 400 feet of stratified rock was laid down. I haven't got time to go into the whole thing, but it all impinges on this fact of how quickly can things happen in what we call geological time if you allow for catastrophe rather than as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be. And I remember reading somewhere that they now think the English Channel was formed in 24 hours. That's probably the hatred of the English for the French that caused that, but they say it happened in 24 hours, that's 21 miles or whatever. So things can happen a whole lot more quickly. And then just to mention natural selection, it's not a creative force, it's rather a conservative force in preserving the species. So if a cow develops an extra leg, that one's most likely to get predated than all the other ones and various other things. And I saw a TV debate between Professor Steve Jones, who's a popular evolutionary scientist, Stephen Fry, who's a popular everything, and John Polkinghorne, who's a clergyman who believes in evolution. And they were challenged by Ken Ham, a creationist. Could you give me one example of evolution actually in action? And the only example they came up with was actually a loss of information. By and large, natural selection involves loss of information. So blind fish do better in very dark caves. So they can lose eyesight, but they're then going to be at a disadvantage if they happen to move out of the cave. Wingless flies kind of get selected on windy islands, but they've lost the ability to fly. Dogs have sort of been selected down from some sort of wolf. Now, I can't imagine poodles roaming the prairies in packs, hunting down bison. Something is lost going down that way. So that's just sort of three spotlights on to things as to why I take this, why I believe what I believe about creation and it being a young earth. I'd just like to throw in as well that a significant number of evolution-believing scientists have actually become creationists because of their work. So they've been working in bio-type things or whatever, and they have said this cannot be understood that way, and they've become creationists as a result. And I say that not to demean anyone who believes in creation and say they're thick. It's just that so often creationists are sort of held up as brainless Bible-believing idiots, whereas I have a book here by 9 PhD scientists who just unbelievably clever there. So we both have resources, I think, that are available for you. Some to take away. This one, please leave a deposit with me before you take it. So I hope that's enough simply to give you some idea of why I believe what I believe. I'll hand back to Stephanie.
Well, Steve and I did discuss a little bit, but not very much, so I'm going to take a completely different tack to him. Because some years ago, I thought my faith would be simpler if I could believe in a young earth. So as a scientist, I have a PhD in physics. Could I claim that Genesis was literally true? And I read many books, usually from America, proving that the earth was between 6,000 and 50,000 years old. And I have to say, the arguments can be convincing if you are not a specialist, but I am a specialist in physics anyway. And when the books talked about physics, they got it very wrong. So arguments from entropy or laws of thermodynamics, the speed of light, cosmic dust, radioactive dating, it was all really unscientific. And I was ready to be convinced, but I could not be convinced by wrong science. So I investigated further, and I discovered that the 6 days of Genesis are set into two triplets, so day 1, 2, and 3, and then day 4, 5, and 6. And so on day 1, we hear about the creation of light and dark, and then on day 4, we hear about the sun and the moon. On day 2, sky and oceans are created, while day 5 fills the sky with birds and the oceans with fish. And on day 3, land with vegetation develops, while day 6 provides animals for the land. And regularly we hear the refrain, and it was evening, and it was morning. And regularly we hear, and God saw that it was good. In my opinion, it's written poetically. It's glorifying God. I don't think it's meant to be taken literally. And it's certainly not a scientific textbook. And I also discovered in my explorations that for centuries the church encouraged science as a way of understanding God's purposes. So Psalm 111 verse 2 says, "Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." And Louis Pasteur, who invented pasteurization, said, "The more I study nature, the more I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. I pray while I am engaged at my work in the laboratory." So the assumption that science and religion are antagonistic is actually quite recent, and I'll say more on that later. Personally, I don't believe in a God who made a world that looks 4.5 billion years old, but is actually only a few thousand. I do realize that there are other people, scientists and Christians, who will disagree with me on that, but that's kind of my line, I suppose. But science encourages us to explore, and actually I think that God encourages us to explore. And science does not have all the answers, but I have to say a little reading of the Bible also has gaps, such as where did Cain's wife come from? Whatever interpretation we hold, we need to live with some unanswered questions. But a verse that I do find helpful is from Isaiah 43 verse 1. "But now this is what the Lord says, He who created you, Jacob, He who formed you, Israel." And here God states that he created the nation of Israel, and the word for created is the same one that's used in Genesis. But God did not instantly create 100,000 men and women. Instead, he chose one man, Abraham, and one woman, and they had a son. And the son married and had two sons, one of whom was called Jacob. And Jacob had more sons who went into Egypt. And the family were in Egypt for over 400 years and had many descendants before God called them out to the land of Canaan, which became known as Israel. God created the nation of Israel through natural processes, a good deal of time, and the occasional miracle. And my experience of God is that he often answers prayers like that, through natural processes, through people and time, with the occasional miracle. And if God answers prayers like that and created the nation of Israel like that, I don't have a problem with God doing the same to create the world. Steve has drawn on a lot of biological examples. I'm not a specialist in biology, but I would say the irreducible complexity, actually, that is one thing I do have a handout on, so you can pick that up later if you wish. But back to the science and religion debate. Copernicus, who said that the Earth orbited the sun, did not see any clash with his Christian faith, and nor did most church leaders. The Vatican established an observatory in 1774, and Newton wrote more about theology than he did about science. I have to say his theology wasn't very good, but he did write more about theology than about science. And I could continue. Darwin lost his faith, but it was not because of evolution. He lost his faith because his favourite daughter died, and he could not cope with the idea of a good God who allowed his daughter to die. So most historical science and religion debates have not centred around proving God's existence or the origins of the world. They have centred around the value of humans. And I think we need to hold on to that, because I actually think that's more important than anything else that we might be debating. So back in the late 1800s, evolution was generally accepted as God's way of creating different species. However, this raised the question, if evolution caused species to grow fitter and better, then was it possible to rank races and individuals? This race comes at the top, and that race comes at the bottom. And this was particularly important in America with their history of slavery. In the early 1900s, in the New York Zoo, they actually put a black man in a cage next to the monkey cage for about 3 weeks, and then there was such an outcry they moved him. But that was the attitude in America at the time. An American book from 1914 referred to low and degenerate races and stated that although we might not want to kill them, we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums, thus preventing the possibilities of reproduction. So Darwin's ideas were being used to justify killing certain races or disabled people or the elderly. And a few decades later, the Nazis used these ideas to rationalize their eugenics. And there was a backlash to this, particularly by Christians who claimed that each person was valued by God. And unfortunately, the backlash did not just support human value, but attacked the science which questioned it. So creationism has actually only been around since 1940, 1961, I think, is one of the main documents. So creationism became a strongly held belief in America, and possibly 30% of Americans still hold that view, although I think they seem to have forgotten the link to equality. So I've kind of moved away from the topic a bit here, but I think we need a wider understanding, which includes history and language and culture. So science and religion are not opposed to one another. I am very happy to be a physicist and also very happy to be a Christian and to teach both. And Jesus came full of grace and truth, not any truth except science. And I would actually, I'm not sure about necessarily people, evolutionary scientists becoming creationists, though I know some books claim that, but I am aware of scientists who have become Christians, not because they think that Genesis is literally true, but because they see that there's a broader outline that is far more true in Genesis than in other creation stories of the time. So I do accept scientific truth about the physical universe, and I would say it's amazing how closely the science matches the Genesis account in broad generalities, not necessarily in literal detail. And I also accept theological truths from Genesis about God and humanity, which are amazingly close to discoveries in psychology. I don't think we need to read the creation accounts literally. But for me, God calls us to seek truth, whether in science or history or theology. and to keep trusting as we follow him.
Thank you, that was great. We're rounding this up by first of all saying that I don't think either of us would think we have got all the answers and that we've got it all laid down. There are plenty of big questions that are still in the air and unanswered for both sides. I don't think either side of this has got it nailed. What we would like is for the debate to be with humility, grace, and Christian charity.
And the psalmist said, the heavens declare the glory of God. I think we are called to explore the world and discover and appreciate God's wisdom, creativity, and love.
And finally, neither of us want you to go away thinking, oh, Steve says that, it must be true, or Stephanie says that, it must be true. What we would like you to do is do the work yourself and research it. There's plenty of stuff available. We've got a few bits you can take away with you. Research it, part because of what Stephanie has said about it all being to the glory of God. The more you know about these things, the greater God's glory will appear. Secondly, more confidence in your own faith, that God is in charge of it all. And then thirdly, and not least important, when somebody says to you, oh, evolution proves God doesn't exist, how are you going to answer that for yourself?
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and over to Rich.